Mic check 1 2 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and there is no doubt that Nintendo still has the hearts, the minds, and the souls of many gamers even to this day. Um, a lot of people consider Nintendo as the best option for gaming, based on their track record and history of not only making iconic consoles like the NES, the Super NES, the Nintendo 64, but also a lot of the iconic games and characters that you see from Super Mario to The Legend of Zelda, Kirby, so on and so forth. And even I myself have to admit that Nintendo has done an amazing job of giving us iconic and amazing video games that are still replayable 30 plus years later. However, there were some things that Sega did better that particularly during the fourth generation console wars, there were things that Sega just did better, in my opinion. And it's for that reason why these are some of the reasons that I'm going to share with you why I felt like Sega was just the better gaming console. Now, this could be, not even this could be, this is purely based on my preferences as a gamer. When we start to talk about Sega versus Nintendo, all of it is based on perspective. None of it is objective. There is no objective way, in my opinion, to say which console was better. You can read off technical facts about each system and state some technical facts, but all the technical facts in the world still will not equate to one console or the other being better in terms of which is a better gaming experience. I think there's way too many factors that go into what makes a great gaming experience to say that because one console had more graphics or a better sound chip or whatever you want to analyze, that one was better. So I'm just going to preface this by saying that this is purely subjective. The entire debate, the entire matter, the entire argument is purely subjective, much like the LeBron versus Jordan debate. But that's another video for another day. Now, sticking with this idea here of what Sega did better, I want to highlight three things that, in my opinion, Sega definitively did better than the Super Nintendo, just based on the two different catalogs, the two libraries of games. Obviously, there are things where Nintendo stood out or the Super Nintendo stood out, but these are areas where I think Sega stood out, and I'm going to get started. The first one for sure is in the context or in the genre of shoot 'em ups. I feel like the Sega Genesis by far had a way better library and a much higher quality library of shoot 'em up games, easily. Here we have a game, Wings of War. This was actually re-released by Limited Run not that long ago under the Japanese name for the game, which I think, it's hard for me to say it, but I think it's called Gyurong. I might be saying it wrong. Somebody can let me know down in the comments how you pronounce that. But that game is essentially Wings of War, and this is a side-scrolling shoot 'em up game, which is very dark. It's very dark, and that's the other thing that Sega kind of did. Sega embraced dark content in the sense of a lot of their games were dark in nature. You saw very scary, gory looking creatures. Sega wasn't afraid to show blood in their video games. They weren't afraid to kind of get a little bit more mature, so to speak. And so Wings of War is a good example of both the dark side that you could see in some of the games, as well as just another amazing shoot 'em up. And the cool thing about Sega is that you could almost make anything a shoot 'em up in Sega. You didn't just have to be in a spaceship or flying a mech. They made the shoot 'em up genre so wide and vast. When you think about games like Wings of War, Phelios, Elemental Master, those games aren't necessarily space shoot 'em ups, but they play like shoot 'em ups, and they're a ton of fun. When I think about the Super Nintendo, there's very few shoot 'em ups that come to mind. Obviously, you've got R-Type 3, you've got the Super R-Type games, you've got Phalanx, you've got UN Squadron. But I think um, the best shoot 'em up that you could probably get for the Super Nintendo, in my opinion, is Space Megaforce, which is an extremely expensive game. But without a doubt, Space Megaforce is an amazing shoot 'em up. Definitely up there. I haven't. It's not in my collection yet. It may enter my collection at some point this year, but Space Megaforce is definitely up there. But we just didn't see enough from Nintendo in the shoot 'em up genre to really make it better than the offerings that you got from the Genesis. And like I said, between the Thunder Force series, Wings of War, Elemental Master, the list goes on and on. I mean, there's just so many to really talk to. It just, Hellfire. I'm not even going to go into all of them. There's just way too many. I just think Sega did that better. Let me know down in the comments if you think I'm wrong there in terms of who did it better, the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. I think Sega Genesis wins the shoot 'em up category hands down. Another thing that I think Sega did better than the Super Nintendo is in the beat 'em up genre, easily. You could argue that the Super Nintendo has some of the best beat 'em ups when you consider the Final Fight series, of course, right? But outside of the Final Fight series, I really can't think of any real top tier beat 'em ups like that coming from the Super Nintendo. Um, I mean, I guess, you could consider Battletoad, Double Dragon. Those were available on both consoles, right? So that wasn't exclusive to the Sega Genesis. But I feel like when you consider the Streets of Rage series, in my opinion, the Streets of Rage series exceeds the Final Fight series. I understand that Final Fight, especially once you started getting around to like Final Fight 3, it started to get real interesting with the special moves and stuff. But I feel like, in my opinion, Streets of Rage 2 just might be the best beat 'em up of all time. It's probably the best beat 'em up of all time in terms of and the crazy thing is that there's not a lot of bells and whistles. There's not a ton of bells and whistles that go into Streets of Rage 2, but it has the best soundtrack, the best sound effects, just the level design, the story is also interesting, and it was just super relevant for its time. I feel like the Streets of Rage series was a much more relatable series than the Final Fight series. I get it, Mayor Hagar, he's trying to save his daughter. That's cool, but it just doesn't hit the same as a group of teens who are trying to clean up the inner city streets. I mean, every state has an inner city. Every state had a part of its city that looked like Streets of Rage back in the day. And I just felt like Streets of Rage just hit a lot harder. So in my opinion, I just felt like the Sega Genesis, it did better with the beat 'em ups. And then the last of them is the last area that I think, Sega just did it better was in the cartoon adaptations. When you consider games like, obviously, the X-Men series, you think about the Spider-Man series, you think about even some of the cartoon games like Pocahontas, if you consider like some of the action movies like Demolition Man, just Sega did a better job, I think, in executing on these TV series / movie adaptations to the video games in that 16-bit era. And I know that a lot of people feel like the Super Nintendo had superior graphics, but I'm willing to put X-Men 2 Clone Wars from a graphics perspective. I put this game up against any video game from the 16-bit era at that time. I know it came out on the Genesis, but when you look at the colors, the character details, the sprite work, the environments, the backgrounds, the music, X-Men 2 Clone Wars I'm surprised that they haven't done, honestly, I'm surprised that Limited Run has not done some type of remaster or remake, re-release, whatever you want to call it, of X-Men and X-Men 2 on the Sega Genesis. These were two games, especially X-Men 2 Clone Wars. This game was way ahead of its time, way ahead of its time in terms of graphics. And I just felt like, again, even though it was based on a cartoon, you just always got this sense of maturity out of these games. They didn't feel like kid games. They felt a little bit more mature than kid games. I guess you would consider it Y7 For those of you who remember back in the day when you watch cartoons, it would put like Y7 or Y13 if it wasn't exactly like rated G or like a kid's show. And so I just felt like there were certain genres that the Sega Genesis just dominated in my opinion. Now, I think Sega did a great, I think the Super Nintendo did a great job when it came to RPGs. I think there are a ton of amazing RPGs that you're really only going to find on the Super Nintendo. I feel like the Super Nintendo just did good with, certain platformers. There were different areas that the Super Nintendo did well in, but I feel like when it came to just action games, shoot 'em up games, beat 'em up games, side scrolling kind of hack and slash style games, just the Genesis did it better. And I guess one last thing that we'll throw on here, obviously excluding some of like the cardboard case games, like X-Men 2, I think Sega just did a way better job of casing their games. These clamshell cases are classic, they're timeless, and 30 plus years later, there is not a blemish on that plastic. This is that hard body, durable 90s plastic. I mean, you could put this in a vest and it might be bulletproof. That's how tough these things are. These are not bulletproof. So please do not listen to that. I was joking. That was a joke. These are not bulletproof. But I do think Sega did it better in these categories. And I don't think it necessarily makes it a better system or a better console than the Super Nintendo. But for me, it was much more enjoyable to play than a Super Nintendo. And if I had to pick one of the two, if you gave me the entire Sega Genesis library and the entire Super Nintendo library, I'm taking the Sega Genesis library 7 times out of 10. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree, disagree? And I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.